win. Okay, so we'll start. Thank you all for joining us online. We are broadcasting from different locations. I'm in Kiev, Ukraine. My name is Timothy Brik. I'm assistant professor at Kiev School of Economics. And despite this invasion and despite the fact that we are being bombed right now and some of my colleagues are in shelters, we still have agreed to have this series of conversations with top leading intellectuals from around the world. We are very happy and very honored to invite many different speakers to talk to us, because we want to send this message that despite the war, we are standing strong as academics, as professors. We try to do what we can do best. We produce knowledge, we consume knowledge, we attend panels, seminars, talks, and we want to show this solidarity to our students and to our colleagues. Some of them are now volunteers, some of them are in the army, some of them, just staying in shelters. But it is very important for us to keep this rolling, to maintain some sense of normality and academic life. And we have hosted incredible speakers already. We had Paul Krugman, Michael McFall, many others. We will host more speakers, but today we have a very special guest for two reasons. He's, first of all, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. He was one of the first people who accepted our invitation, and we are very grateful for that. But also, he's a very famous political scientist. He's professor at New York University. I watched many of his YouTube videos and TED Talks, and he will be speaking about something which is very relevant today to the world. He will be speaking about the issue of authoritarian regimes and democracy and regime change. How can it happen? And many details that can be discussed around these topics. And I have to say that I personally have a student who is working on a master thesis now, and he uses some of these theories which Professor de Mesquita will be talking about. So we are very grateful for you, for your time, for talking to us. And please, this online floor is all yours, and we will be happy to listen to your talk.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. It's very courageous of all of you to continue your academic lives. It's an important thing to do. And I'm honored to be in the same forum as Mike McFall, my former colleague at Stanford, and Paul Krugman, with whom I've served on PhD committees. So let me share my screen and get started. So I want to talk about selectorate theory and whether or not democracy is fragile, which is a new chapter in the second edition of the Dictator's Handbook, which will be out in a few weeks. So the standard view of governments and governance is that there's a continuum between democracy and autocracy, or more arbitrarily, you draw a line and say, okay, these guys are democratic, these guys are autocratic. And that seems to me to be a deeply problematic way to think about governments. And we can get a lot more insight by thinking about them differently, and I will illustrate that specifically with Ukraine's case. So first thing we have to ask whenever somebody draws a continuum from autocracy to democracy, or draws a sharp line between them, well, what's more democratic? Is a presidential political system more democratic than a parliamentary system? Are plurality rules for elections more democratic than runoff rules or proportional representation? In the world of autocratic governments, are juntas, monarchies, and single-party systems alike? They certainly are not. So we want to think about what are the things that shape governance. Judgments, it's democratic, it's autocratic, seems to me way too casual. Behavior seems to confuse what we want to explain with the definitions we use. I think institutions will prove to be critical. I also think that the general focus that people have on elections is misguided. I know certainly among American social scientists, you hear discussions about a government is more legitimate if it holds elections. There was nothing legitimate about the Soviet Union's elections. They were rigged. Everybody knew the results before the election was held. So I'm more concerned with accountability and transparency and the extent to which individual voters may be acting as individuals on their own volition or are part of blocs that are controlled by a small group of people. So I prefer to think of a nonlinear, nested view of governance in which any society, any organization, in fact, this theory applies to any organization, has a population. It has a nominal selectorate. I'll define these terms in a moment, a real selectorate, a winning coalition, and possibly blocs embedded within the coalition. So we can define a society as N residents. S is the selectorate. These are the people who have at least a nominal say in choosing leaders. So in the old Soviet system, there was universal adult suffrage. So the nominal selectorate were all adults who were citizens. They could vote. The real selectorate was a smaller subset of that. The key feature from my perspective of members of the selectorate is that they are candidates to be members of a winning coalition. I again go back to the illustration of the Soviet Union. What was the difference between the Tsarist system and the system that Lenin put into place? Now, the fundamental difference was not in who were the people that were essential to keep the leader in power, the winning coalition. In both cases, they were very small groups. The difference was that in the Tsarist regime, the royal family essentially made up the selectorate. In Lenin's system, his great insight was actually invented in Liberia, but I'm sure he didn't know that, was to have universal suffrage with a very tiny group of people who actually mattered, which turns out from a leader's point of view to be the best sort of political system. It's the worst from a citizen's point of view. So W is the winning coalition. It's a subset of the selectorate, and by assumption, it's a simple majority or less. So it can be tiny. Actually, in my co-authored book, The Logical Political Survival, if anybody's interested, we relax the majority condition, and there are a set of proofs for what happens if the coalition is more than is allowed to be a supermajority. And I'm going to assume a budget constraint, R, and I'm going to understand, of course, revenue is determined strategically, but for most of today's talk, I'm going to focus on revenue as given, although the theory has a lot to say about how revenue is raised. So to give you a rough idea of the correspondence between the two-dimensional institutional space that selectorate theory implies, a winning coalition on the vertical axis, selectorate on the horizontal axis, and sort of standard labels, monarchies and juntas have small winning coalitions and small selectorates. Rigged election autocracies also have small winning coalitions, but they have large selectorates. Directly elected presidential democracies have very large winning coalitions. I emphasize the United States is not a directly elected presidential system, and so on. So in the theory, leaders primarily want to survive in office. That's their first objective. Conditional on survival, they want to maximize their control over discretionary revenue. As you are sadly seeing at the moment, Vladimir Putin has a huge amount of discretionary revenue. He didn't have to rewrite the country's budget, didn't need to recalibrate the defense budget and so forth. He could simply make the decision on his discretion and then pretend to get authorization to wage a war. Every leader faces at least a domestic challenger. They may also face threats from the people in terms of mass uprising and from their winning coalition in terms of coup d'etat, which I will come to in a bit. The incumbent loses power if two conditions are satisfied. That is, the challenger builds a coalition at least of size W, and the incumbent loses the support of at least one member of her winning coalition. This too is relaxed in the appendix to chapter 3, and we can see what the consequences are if we have only one condition. Anyway, continuing with assumptions, we make an extreme assumption, which is not essential, that the leader is committed to retain all members of the coalition after a transition period. So they sort, you come to power, you sort people out, you pick you think you can, will give you maximum security in terms of survival, most loyal to you at lowest cost, you get rid of others. The challenger can't make that commitment because they don't know yet who those people will be. So the challenger will take support from anybody to come to power. And then after who they can work with, they sort it out. So therefore, the probability of being in the challenger's post-transition winning coalition is simply how large a pool of people are there who could be in it, that's the denominator, and how big a set of people do I need to draw from that pool. And in a considerably more complex, mathematically denser version of the theory that Alastair Smith, myself, and Tom Legata published in 2017, and then a variant on it that Smith and I did in 2018. We don't need that. We create a world in which there are groups or blocks of interests, and we shift from a world, which is the world that I'm going to talk about today, of public and private goods, to a world of public goods, private goods, and club goods to the blocks. And then we don't need W over S, but really all that we need is that the probability of being in the successor winning coalition for the challenger is lower than the expected probability of remaining in the incumbent's winning coalition. Leaders do three things in this theory. They make taxing decisions and they make spending decisions. They allocate some of the revenue that they bring in as public goods that benefit everybody. I'm going to use the term public goods more casually than an economist normally would, but in the flavor of public goods, because the theory moves into a club good world as well. Leaders allocate revenue as private goods to the coalition members. That's opportunities, for example, at corruption. And any unspent revenue is at the leader's discretion, and the leader can either be a kleptocrat and steal the money, socking it away in secret bank accounts, or they can be civic-minded and have public projects in mind. And among those who are civic-minded, they fall into two groups. Those who I would describe as good at public policy, Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore, Deng Xiaoping in China, who understood how to use resources to build the economy and the quality of life of citizens, and people who were really bad at it. Mao Zedong had very dumb ideas about how to build the Chinese economy. Kwame Nkrumah had really bad ideas in Ghana and so forth. Okay, to give you a quick fix on how this theory works simply, trivially, in predicting corruption, let's just look for the moment at the budget constraint. So I've got R revenue, and I'm spending it on public and private goods. G are public goods and X are private goods. P is the unit price of buying a public good. And W, the size of the winning coalition, is the implicit price of private goods. It's how many people I have to provide them to. So trivially, we see that if we rearrange the budget constraint, that R minus PG over W is at least as large as X, private goods, meaning that as the coalition increases, in colloquial terms, as the government becomes more democratic or more accountable, then private goods decrease. And as the coalition becomes smaller, in colloquial terms, more autocratic, then private goods weakly increase as a proportion of expenditures. So a quick little empirical test. The highlighted area is an estimate of the size of a winning coalition. And a couple of quick things to note here. The dependent variable is the absence of corruption. It's honest governance. So, is the presence of corruption. the transparency reversed index. So the larger the coalition, I've controlled in one regression for just polity size and another for the standard cut point for democratic polity greater than 6. And in the third, I've controlled for polity's absolute maximum. And what we see is that the variable that is doing almost all of the work here is coalition size. The standard error is in parentheses. The coefficient, the t statistic on this coefficient is approximately 20, astronomically large, and we're explaining almost 90% of the variance in corruption, overwhelmingly simply by knowing coalition size and fixing it to the size of the economy, per capita income and population. Okay, so every leader has an incumbency constraint. They have to beat the challenger. So the leader has to pay the coalition just enough so that the members prefer to remain loyal rather than to defect. The challenger, of course, wants to come to power. So the challenger makes the best offer that they can make, but they can't commit to keeping their transition supporters in their winning coalition over the long haul. So after gaining powers, leaders learn the loyalty of different people, and they choose those they expect to be most loyal. Once loyalty is learned, the post-transition coalition members know that they will be retained if they continue to remain loyal, and the incumbent only pays the coalition members just enough to beat the expected value offered by the challenger. There's no point in spending more, taking into account the risk that defectors might be cut off from future private goods. So a little math, I won't spend much time on it. Best possible offer by the challenger is today the utility that any member of the coalition of the challenger's coalition can derive by dividing the revenue among the members of the coalition. But for all future days, they can only expect the future flow to come to them with probability W over S if they get the public and private goods. I'll talk about M star in a moment. And with probability 1 minus W over S, they just get the public goods. So M star is the optimal allocation of public and private goods given the coalition size that is compatible with coming to and staying in power. It turns out in equilibrium that how much of the revenue has to be spent, so M star is PG plus WX, is increasing as the coalition increases. So as the coalition gets bigger, as it gets more democratic, two things are happening. The probability of remaining in the coalition is increasing. W over S is getting bigger, but the unique value of the coalition, the private goods, is getting smaller. So the total pie being spent on the coalition is growing. The probability of staying in the coalition is growing as it gets bigger, and the marginal value of being in the coalition is getting smaller. So the expected utility of any member of the coalition, given they remain loyal, is the income flow of public and private goods over, in this example, the infinite horizon. And we have a version of this, which is not an infinite horizon, which I'm not going to spend much time on today because it's just the math is a lot more complicated, but the essential results are the same. The expected utility of a member of the coalition, given that they defect, is that the infinite horizon starting tomorrow is with probability W over S, they get both goods, and with 1 minus W over S, they only get the public goods. So you remain loyal as long as the expected utility of being loyal is larger than the expected utility of defecting. And then we can add to that health shocks, revenue shocks, economic shocks, and that'll will shift conditions. Leaders drop from power at times, and leaders cannot always take corrective steps, which I will be talking about in equilibrium under those conditions. Okay, so let's get a little detailed about what the theory predicts, and then we can talk about how it applies to Ukraine. So what is the welfare of a leader? as the coalition gets bigger, the leader's welfare is strictly decreasing because the amount of revenue that has to be spent to survive in power, to keep the coalition loyal, is increasing. And so the leader's discretionary money is disappearing. What does the welfare of members of the coalition look like? It looks like the Nike swoosh. It's an asymmetric, non-monotonic function. Initially, members, when the coalition is really small, members of the winning coalition do very well. But as I said, several things are happening as the coalition gets bigger, holding the selectorate constant. The private goods are being divided among more people, so there are fewer per individual. The amount being spent is increasing, slowly at first, and the probability of being in the successor coalition is improving, again, slowly at first. So this has several consequences, and we'll come to those in a moment. This function ought to be asymptotic. I'm just not good at drawing the curve. This is the welfare of the ordinary citizen or resident, people not in the coalition, either the disenfranchised or in the selectorate. So theirs is increasing as public goods increases and private goods decrease. And as you see, it's converging on the welfare of coalition members because the marginal value of being in the coalition is getting smaller as the coalition gets bigger. Okay, below this dotted line is the region of credible revolutionary threats. That is, if we look at the expected utility for remaining with the leader minus the expected utility of rebelling, when we get below the dotted line, rebelling dominates staying loyal. And we will see two cut points that will be of considerable interest in a moment. So when we cross either of these two cut points, which are theoretically derived, then there is no credible threat. There are either too few or too many public goods. In the case of too many public goods, people have a high probability of succeeding if they rebel against the government, but they have no incentive to rebel because they're getting lots of benefits from the government. On the low end, places like North Korea, there are so few public goods that the opportunity for people to coordinate, to mount a rebellion is very low. So the probability of a rebellion succeeding is very low, although they would love to rebel. It's just the risk and costs are way too high. And in these two zones, those events just don't happen. But there is another cut point. And this other cut point is really important. It's been very important in the last few years for Ukraine, as I will address in a bit. So when a leader faces a credible threat of rebellion, of revolution, mass uprising, there are two things the leader can do. They can contract public goods, and if they contract public goods, then in equilibrium, they need to shrink the coalition. They need to purge people so that the mix of public-private goods is correct. So this black dotted line is the welfare of a leader if they contract public goods, expand private goods. And to the left of this midpoint, it's not midpoint, but this third red line that I added, governments in equilibrium become more autocratic. They reduce public goods, but they can also expand public goods. So there are two ways to buy off the threat of rebellion. One is to crush it by paying coalition better, and the other is by bringing more people into the coalition to be more accountable, produce more public goods. So this green dotted line is what happens to the leader's welfare if the leader improves public goods rather than reduces it. And it should be intersecting the black line right on that red line, but it's not, unfortunately. I'm not that good at drawing these things. But in any event, the red cut point, this point here, is the dividing line where expanding the coalition's size comes to dominate contracting the coalition's size from the point of view of the leader, the person in the best position to make this change. So to the right of this red line, the leader is better off increasing public goods, making the coalition larger, becoming more accountable. And to the left of this red line, the leader is better off purging members of the coalition, reducing public goods, increasing private goods, could also take it out of his or her own pocket, to stabilize regime. You can see the leader's expected utility is higher to the left of the red line and lower for contracting, and is higher for expanding public goods to the right. So over on the right, they liberalize. Now we'll just take this away for a moment and we'll notice something else. The local maximum at which the winning coalition does best when it's very small. If we project that across, we see that's where the right-hand red line was located. We see where it intersects the welfare of coalition members. So everywhere inside the bowl that is formed by this dotted line is the region in which there are threats to the stability of the government, threats of coups, threats of mass uprisings, and in response, counter moves in terms of making the country less accountable or more accountable. If we go to the right of that point, you see the coalition's welfare is strictly higher by expanding. And so once you cross that cut point, no government, I've got 200 years of data, no government that has crossed that cut point has ever stopped being democratic internally. The only examples of places that stopped being democratic were, for example, France after it was conquered by the Nazis in 1940, the Netherlands, Belgium, so forth. That is, external invasion can topple a democracy. Domestic circumstances don't once that cut point has been crossed. All right, so I have estimated the location in terms of coalition welfare of all the countries in your neighborhood. Belarus, Russia, yourselves, Poland, Romania, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Slovakia. So we can see several things. This is a strictly statistically estimated graph. So on the horizontal axis, we're looking at the size of the winning coalition. Ukraine's winning coalition is around 0.76, which is short of that critical right-hand cut point. But I will speak about what's been happening in Ukraine and what I expect to happen, assuming you survive this horrible invasion. There are, you see, most countries are efficient. They are just about on the estimated swoosh curve function. Russia's overpaying its coalition a little bit. Belarus, this is in 2021, Belarus and Ukraine are the only two countries that were below the curve, meaning in your neighborhood of Europe, you were the only two countries that looked politically vulnerable. And Belarus, of course, had an uprising, which with the help of the Russians was crushed. And you were on your pathway to political change, as I'm going to demonstrate in a moment, in response to being below the curve, because what is taking you below the curve is primarily that you are your government was providing, this is an odd thing to say, too few private goods, too little corruption for the size of the coalition, a strong indicator that the expectation, as we saw back in here, was to increase the coalition. That is, to be on the green line. See that in a moment. We'll see evidence of that. Okay, so you're in a neighborhood that's generally looking pretty politically stable internally. I'm not talking about external threats. Slovakia tending slightly, very slightly below the curve. Of course, these are estimates. You and Belarus noticeably below, and Russia above. So let me make a quick comment on Russia being above. Being above, Russia's coalition is around 0.55 on this 0 to 1 scale. being above the curve, first blush, one might think, well, that's very nice. The insiders in Putin's winning coalition are getting paid even more than they need to. He's being generous. If I were them, I would look at that and I would know that as a statistical matter, when a coalition is overpaid and the overpayment is increasing, it's an indication that the intention of the leader is to purge members of the coalition, shrink it at that price. It will then per person will be the same price, but the total price will be lower. There'll be more discretionary revenue. From that position, where Russia is located, it is unlikely, but not impossible, that it would expand its winning coalition. We can see it can keep the same welfare by purging down to around here, or it could expand up to here. So it could go either way, but I'm guessing that Mr. Putin's inclinations are not to move to a larger coalition. Anyway, what have been the changes in Ukraine from 2015 to 2021, and what can we begin to infer from them? So, the fewest private goods that Ukraine has provided in this 6-year window were in 2020 and 2021. That is during the Zelensky presidency. And they're too few. It's below the curve on private goods, but it's less below the curve than it was. I didn't say that well. It provided more corruption before. He has been reducing corruption. What's the signal of that is that the winning coalition is likely to expand in order to attain stability domestically. If we for the moment could put aside the Russian invasion, if Ukraine survives the Russian invasion, the expectation would be that to restore domestic stability, Zelensky would be expanding the winning coalition to be aligned with the too few private goods that are being provided. The most private goods were provided in 2019, just before he came to office. That was in this 6-year window, the peak of corruption in Ukraine. Public goods. So there were the fewest public goods were being provided about equally from 2015 and 16 and 2019. These were according to my estimates, the worst years in terms of providing healthcare, education, infrastructure, so forth. The most public goods, again, are in the Zelensky 2020 and 2021, still too few, but moving up. They were getting better and better, close to being on the curve. So all of these are indicators that his government is moving, setting up the conditions to expand the coalition. Now, the smallest coalition was in 2018, and in this window of 6 years, the largest coalition was in 2021. And as I say, the indicators are that he would have been expanding it, making Ukraine increasingly an accountable, transparent, responsible government, all to the good. So what decides good or bad governance? Well, big coalitions and big selectorates are democratic societies. Big selectorates and small coalitions are rigged election autocracies. And when they're both small, monarchies and juntas. So what does that mean? Well, when governance depends on a large coalition, what we know empirically, and we derive this theoretically as well, societies have higher per capita incomes. So Ukrainians could expect improvements in their income as the indicators are that the coalition size was going to grow. They're healthier, people live longer, they have lower infant mortality rates, and they're freer. They have more press freedom, more freedom of assembly, more free speech, more freedom of movement, and you're in reasonably good shape on those things. And they're more transparent. The government reports more information that can be independently assessed rather than not reporting the information. Overall, they're better places to live. They have higher immigration rates and lower emigration rates. They're places people want to come to. and when the coalition is small. So the horizontal axis here is controlling for the magnitude of earthquakes and the population density in the area where the earthquakes occurred. I've simply divided countries in sort of the label democratic and autocratic. The red triangles are large coalitions and the blue squares are autocrats. And you can see at any given size of earthquake, the number of deaths, logarithmic scale on the vertical axis, the number of deaths is consistently lower in democratic societies than in autocratic societies. This is controlling for population density. The stats also control for per capita income and so forth. When you're an autocrat, when you depend on few people to keep you in power, you don't care very much about the rest of the people. They're not the ones you need. When you're a larger coalition, you need the support of many, many people, millions of people. So you do things like place seismic detectors more strategically to make sure that you know when trouble is brewing. You have better building codes. You make sure buildings are more secure and so forth. So I won't go through all this, but this is a summary of some of the major implications of selectorate theory. The metric of political survival is the difference between revenue and the resources that have to be spent. So it's the leader's discretionary money. When the coalition is small, incumbents have a huge incumbency advantage. They can be fairly certain of permanently remaining in their coalition, and their challengers have access to future private goods only probabilistically. So in the first year or roughly in power, interestingly, autocrats don't survive as well as Democrats. But once the first 6 months or first year in office are over, Democrats are much less likely to survive in power. So one of the mistakes people make is they look at new leaders in autocracies and they see reforms and say, oh, this guy's a reformer, things are going to be better. And almost always they're not a reformer. They're emulating a Democrat till they figure out where the money is. So when the coalition is large, good public policy and low corruption are what improve survival. And when the coalition is small, good public policy is bad politics. Corruption, black markets, bribery, these are the means to survival. Institutions shape the policy choices of leaders, and institutions shape how nations interact with the wider world. Larger coalition systems need successful foreign policies, and small coalition leaders only need to pay off their supporters. I will be quiet and try to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving this very elaborate talk, which ranges from mathematical foundations of your theory to references to data and also Ukraine. I think that was fantastic experience to listen to that. I will remind our listeners that you can ask questions in the comment sections and Q&A here on Facebook and YouTube. And while maybe people they're shy or they don't know what to ask, I will start with my own questions. And I have to be frank with you that this theory, even though it's very well known in political science in the West, it has not been so popular, even known in Ukraine and neighboring countries. So I guess my questions might sound silly to you, but I just want to clarify several things to make sure that everyone is on the same page and our students also understand what's happening here. And I will ask a couple clarifications about some basic terms which you used, starting from selectorate and winning coalition. So you showed this graph where Ukraine had 0.8 on the x-axis, talking about the size of winning coalition. So can you help us to define what's happening here? Because Ukraine, we can talk in specifics. Zelensky is a president. He was elected by many people. He received a lot of popular support in Ukraine. And in the parliament, he also has one of the biggest parties in the history of Ukraine. So his party dominates the parliament, meaning that this party does not have to build coalition. They just don't need coalitions because they can vote for whatever they need. So I guess it's a bit counterintuitive for Ukrainians to understand what's happening here. So, okay, he has this big party. Is this a big winning coalition because the party is big, or is it small because they don't have connections to other coalitions? So what's going on here? Can you elaborate, please?
Yeah, it's neither of those. The size of the coalition has nothing to do with how many votes a candidate gets, or directly nothing to do with turnout. What it has to do with is the institutional structures that make it possible for political parties to form around any set of beliefs and principles, and for the formation of parties to be independent, the degree to which it is independent of government regulation, and the extent to which leadership in parties is independent of heredity, military ties, religious ties, etc. So it's a bunch of the 5 institutional dimensions that shape the expectation of how much support is necessary, not how much do you have, but how much of what you have you need to stay in power. So, for example, Ukraine uses, if I'm not mistaken, a runoff electoral system. So to make it into the runoff, if you have lots of candidates in the first round, you could have in principle, I'm not talking about how much anyone has, I'll give a concrete example in a moment. In principle, you could have very little support if the vote is divided among a lot of parties to make it into the runoff. And then it's predetermined that somebody of the 2 parties in the runoff is going to get a majority. So that majority doesn't mean anything. What means something are the constraints on how many parties could compete and so forth. So we estimate this for every country every year, so I haven't burrowed into each country's details. But a few years ago, and it may have changed since the government has changed, I did burrow a little bit into details in Ukraine. At the time of the Crimean invasion, President Obama was being advised to provide military assistance to Ukraine. And he kept saying, why doesn't somebody tell me how to fix this problem without force? And so Alastair Smith and I wrote a couple of articles on how Ukraine's government could have addressed the problem at the time. You may or may not remember, there was a referendum scheduled to be held. And what Alastair and I noted at that time is that the nominally Russian ethnic Ukrainians in the East had higher per capita incomes than the more European-oriented Ukrainians in the West. The government was controlled by the more pro-European Ukrainians. So what was happening is that folks in the East were paying disproportionately taxes to support the policies of folks they didn't agree with on policy. And part of the problem was at that time, the political party structure prohibited pre-election alliances among political parties, which is a mechanism that ensures that you keep the coalition smaller. Because once parties can coordinate with each other to cooperate before an election, they can pool, okay, we won't run anybody against you in this constituency because you're more popular, and you won't run anybody against us in that constituency because we're more popular, we won't waste votes. So these were some of the limitations at the time. At the time as well, the judiciary in Ukraine was not fully independent. It's extremely easy and cheap to make an independent judiciary. Naively, you could take all of the qualified attorneys in Ukraine. Everybody is licensed to practice law in Ukraine. Put their names in a big drum, rotate it, and pull out the number of necessary names, and you've got an independent judiciary. So these were some of the things that were keeping the coalition size down. Many of those things have been improved upon since then. As I said, the coalition in 2015-16 was at its smallest. So it's grown, but it's only grown a little bit. It's gone up from about 0.68 on my scale to about 0.76. Nice improvement, but there's room for a lot more. So coalition size is strictly to do with the ease with which parties can, the political system allows for competition. The more competition, the more you're going to need to win. So by way of illustration, Tanzania for many years was thought to be democratic because it had free and fair elections. They didn't cheat at the polls, but they had a British-style Westminster political system, first past the post. That, Duverger told us that should be a two-party system. They had 10, 11, 12 political parties competing in each of the parliamentary districts. That immediately triggered for me, I did a study for the World Bank on this, that the system was looking free and fair, but was artificially reducing how much support you needed to win. One party, the CCM, always won. Now, they got a huge percentage of the vote, but it turned out they only needed about 5 or 6% in most districts to win. It was a small coalition system, even though they were getting massive voter turnout.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So basically, I was confused a bit by the semantics. So when you say size, this is not about numbers of people or numbers of members of parliament. It's kind of a scale which is created as a function of many parameters that defined as institutional capacity for political competition. So
exactly.
Yeah. And so I guess I want just to continue with one more clarification, and there will be a question in the chat, but I want to clarify one thing before. It's also kind of intuitive, I think, to understand what you mean by public goods, but can you provide this kind of additional elaboration about private goods? So you mean that you called it corruption, but you smiled a lot. So I guess you winked us that this is not exactly the corruption, but this is some mechanism which allow politicians kind of to I don't know, to satisfy voters or something like that. Or elites. Can you elaborate on what's happening there?
So private goods could just be the salaries of the insiders, right? They could just be paid very well. I mean, for example, larger coalition leaders are among the worst paid leaders in the world compared to smaller coalition leaders. But paying people is likely to arouse objection if you pay them huge amounts of money. So a much more efficient way to have private goods is to give people in the inner circle the opportunity to have favoritism in contracts, misappropriate funds, and so forth. When Yasser Arafat was alive, for example, he ordered an external legitimate audit of the books of the Palestinian Authority, and people were mystified why he would do that. They were even more mystified when the auditing company reported that 3/4 of the budget was being stolen and that he was stealing more of it than anybody else. Well, that was okay with him because he now knew how much each of his ministers was stealing. And as long as they were loyal to him, no problem. Yeah, that's the rule. You get these benefits and I get you to do what I want politically. On the other hand, if any of them were disloyal, it's really unseemly to put somebody in prison or shoot them for being not politically loyal. But, oh, you're a crook, you're corrupt. I can put you in prison for that. So they knew that he knew how corrupt they were. And as long as they stuck with him, he stuck with them. And if any of them deviated, then off to prison they went. That's exactly what Xi Jinping has been doing in China. If you look at who his anti-corruption campaign has imprisoned, it is the backers of his political rivals, not any of his loyal supporters near the top. So by private goods, we have in mind any of the excludable, rival, depletable goods that go to members of the coalition and to nobody else. And the most common form for that is corruption opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. And I see two questions. One was on the YouTube, another one here in the chat, and I will just proceed with them. And maybe I will have my a privilege of moderator to ask a final question as well. So the YouTube question, is there anything that can be done to expand a nation's winning coalitions from outside?
Almost never. One of the papers that colleague unfortunately died a few years ago, George Downs and I wrote a number of years ago, was on the efforts to spread more democratic governance through military intervention. We asked a very simple question. Following military intervention by democratic countries, by autocratic countries, or by the United Nations, which of these interveners were more likely to leave with a more democratic government than when they intervened? And the theory said that the least democratization relative to the background levels of democratization going on in the world, the least democratization would be induced by democratic interveners. And that was sadly true. And the reason is straightforward. Within this theory, it's a very depressing theory. The mission of a democratically elected leader is to satisfy his or her winning coalition, which is a large part of the electorate, or they wouldn't win in a democratic society. Their job is not to make the well-being of other people better or worse. It's to make the lives of their key supporters better. Now, if an intervention takes place in a society whose population shares the same values as the intervener, then the country is likely to become more democratic. If the country in which the intervention occurs doesn't share the values, then the country is likely to get some of the window dressing of democracy, because the folks at home don't like outright oppression, but only the window dressing, rigged elections, that sort of thing, as opposed to real democracy. Whereas the UN and autocrats do nothing one way or the other to change the governments particularly. In the case of autocrats, they look to extract goodies, private benefits, tribute for their coalition. In the case of the UN, it's essentially a powerless institution, so it does nothing. But Democrats rarely externally promote democracy. The few examples, Germany after World War II, Japan after World War II, South Korea since the 1960s. We might note in the case of Japan, it has the least free press of any member of the OECD. It's essentially a one-party state still. If I won't go into the details of the emergence of Japanese elections, but they could be a lot more competitive than they are.
Yeah, thank you. And another question is quite long. I will try to give you a short version of it. And basically, this is a question about Russia and the likelihood of elite or regime change in Russia. So the person who is asking this question, he points out, to what is happening now about sanctions and the fact that we already see some signals that Russian elites are not quite satisfied with what is happening. There are signals on social media, and some of them, left the country. So I guess the question is broadly about your estimation. What can happen next? Whether the consensus in elites is going to change, and whether it can influence either a coup or stagnation of Russian regime.
So let me preface this, because it's obviously a very sensitive topic, with the observation I am not an expert on Russia, but I'm pretty knowledgeable about how regimes change. So if we look at this figure, and you see Russia's sort of leaning kind of towards the center of this graph, and it's overpaying the coalition. So there are three things that can happen. Payments can drop down onto the curve. They can just fall, or they can move to purge or to expand. So I would say under the sanctions regime, Putin is in a very vulnerable position. Coup more likely than mass uprising, but mass uprising is not impossible. He's right at the bottom of the bowl. That's an area where both of those events can occur. And that's really important, because the corrective measures to offset the threat of a coup are opposite to the corrective measures to offset the threat of a mass uprising. So he has to gamble on which he thinks is the dominant threat. And since both are credible threats here, he's in a very difficult position. I would say that what the sanctions have done is make members of the winning coalition, put them in a situation where they are receiving fewer private goods than they are accustomed to or than they expect, in a very interesting situation. My co-author, Alastair Smith, and his late wife, Fiona McGillivray, wrote on this subject quite a bit. If you are looking at the sanctions, they will be lifted if it could be another autocrat, but a more amenable autocrat comes to power. If, for example, somebody in Russia came to power who's willing to withdraw from Ukraine, the sanctions would probably be lifted. So from the perspective of his winning coalition, that's a strong signal that if they defect to a rival, they can restore their corrupt economic situation to something closer to what it was before. It's not a domestic economic shock that's occurred, it's a political shock. So he's highly vulnerable to coup threat. And there's a second element that makes him highly vulnerable to a coup threat. When the threat of mass uprising is growing, it's low but growing in Russia, and it's not super low, then members of the coalition have three choices. Back the incumbent, because they think he can keep paying them. Back the rebellion, that's what the military did in Egypt in the Arab Spring. Back the rebellion in the hopes that then some of the military will be brought into the subsequent winning coalition, or launch a coup. The incentive to back Putin has dropped significantly because he can't pay them. The incentive to back a rebellion or a coup has grown significantly. Rebellion riskier, because probably if the people rose up and overthrew the government, they would overthrow what we call the oligarchs as well. So their best shot, their best bet, the inner circle's best bet, is a coup where they could get, by putting in a less dangerous autocrat, they could get much of their money restored. So yeah, I think that's the most credible threat. Coups are never super high probability, but he is at the location on the winning coalition scale, which is almost at the peak of the risk of coup d'etat. So he's in a dangerous spot.
Yeah, quite. Even though you premised it saying that you're not an expert on Russia, but sometimes these generalizations from history, from mathematical models, from 200 years of data, of course, can tell us, reasonably about the risks and what can happen. So, yeah, thanks for this elaboration. Yeah, I don't see any more questions, but I want to ask my own. We almost run out of time. I hope it's fine if I take an extra minute here. But we talked about definitions and some details and Russia, but now I want to ask a more kind of big picture, broader questions in terms of the scholarship. Yeah. So when I was a student and I was reading something about regime change, I remember, at least in my time, when I had or sometimes was even forced to read something for a seminar, the literature I read was dominated by these two names, and it was presented like a big debate. I don't know if this is true, but that's how I received it in my education. It was presented as a debate between Karl Boish and Acemoglu, and the debate was about inequality. Yeah, so on the one hand, you need some sort of a progressive level of inequality, and there is a correlation. The more inequality you have, the more likely the regime change is. And on the other hand, there was this position of Acemoglu that there must be some sort of a middle level inequality, because if the protest is too poor and the government is too rich, the government will just crush the protest, and etc. And now, I'm hearing a very different story from your side. You're kind of talking about very similar things. You're talking about elites and coalitions. You also talk about private goods and common goods and public goods and even club goods, but you never used this word inequality. And you never talk about poor and rich masses and elites. Yeah. So I wonder, how can we connect your story and their story? Are they just two sides of the same thing, or maybe these are two independent theories that address some kind of unique questions, and we don't need to confuse your theories? I don't know. Can you even answer to this question? Maybe I'm just imagining things. Yeah.
It's a wonderful question. I'll and I prefer to see proof of argument. Acemoglu and Robinson is formal and leads to many implications that are similar to what selectorate theory leads to, but with some important differences, which you just focused on. So let me make a few observations. Let me preface this with, they are both friends, and they're not here to defend their theory against mine. So in the Acemoglu-Robinson account of politics and their model, there are rich and poor people. Rich people remain rich and poor people remain poor. In the real world and in selectorate theory, rich people can become poor and poor people can become rich. There is no mobility across the groups in Acemoglu and Robinson. If you get into the winning coalition, you get rich. If you are ousted in a coup or rebellion, you get poor in a hurry. So there is much more social mobility and no fixed class structure. There are poor people and rich people, but that's a consequence of the kind of incentives that the leadership has to have an entrepreneurial economy, competitive economy, so on and so forth, which is absent in Acemoglu and Robinson. In Acemoglu and Robinson, many of the critical factors that produce rebellion and inequality, so forth, are exogenously given. In selectorate theory, they are endogenous. So, for example, I noted that from certain positions within the curve, the equilibrium is to increase public goods or to decrease public goods and increase private goods. And if you do either of those, if you're in the circumstance where either one of those is the equilibrium that you're in, then your winning coalition size, your institutions, are no longer in equilibrium with the allocation of the budget between public and private goods. So you have to adjust the coalition. So the institutions change endogenously in selectorate theory, not exogenously. That to me is an important advantage. It's why, as I understand it, the World Bank uses selectorate theory and not so much the Acemoglu-Robinson theory, because this theory, since so much is endogenous, allows you to make policy choices with an expectation about consequence. Of course.
Oh. There is some interruption with the internet, so I'll wait.
Is the superior theory. Theirs is simpler. The math is much simpler in their structure than in ours. But that's in part because so many big things are exogenous, whereas they're endogenous here.
Well, yeah, thank you. By the way, we reached out to both of your friends, and they will also participate in our activities. So I'll be able to ask these questions to them. And, you know, from my perspective, I'm a sociologist by training. So for me, things like fluidity of social classes and social mobility, they just make sense because that's how I was socialized. Yeah. So I always think about different social groups and how can they change over time and mobility. So it makes a lot of sense to me, at least. Or, you know, maybe also it's because sociologists don't study math so much. That's why I'm sometimes confused. Yeah. But I saw you wanted to say something.
Yes, I wanted to add one further observation with regard to class structure from this figure. So, everything in this graph is derived mathematically from the logic of the theory, from its assumptions. I would like people to notice that if you are to the right of the rightmost red cut point, then revolutions don't occur. That's exactly the region where Karl Marx's theory of class predicted revolution was most likely, because almost all of the advanced capitalist societies are also very large coalition regimes sitting to the right of that cut point. There has never been a revolution in the places that Marxist theory tells us revolution is most likely. Now, in Marx's empirical defense, when he was writing, roughly between 1840 and 1880, there were no countries, no governments to the right of that cut point. They didn't exist. Part of Australia a bit, but okay, essentially didn't exist. So he lived in a world in which he saw revolution. What he failed to recognize, which this sort of theorizing forces us to recognize, is that if a leader wants to maximize survival rather than wealth, and then wealth second, then they have to anticipate threats. And so in the Marxist view of the world, there was no adjustment to producing more public goods to make people better off so that while they could successfully rebel, they didn't have the incentive. This is what Lenin, I think, later referred to as trade union mentality. But Marxist theory did not look at expectation or anticipation by the people who would be the targets of revolution and the corrective steps they could take. And Acemoglu and Robinson, not as well as this theory. Look at that.
Oh, don't get a sociologist started to talk about Marxism and what they did get wrong and everything. I can do it all day, but yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, so and I'm fascinated with this evolution and development of both mathematical foundations and empirical data, and you know the style of a dialogue. So it's It's been such a pleasure to watch your presentation. And I mean, despite the difficult times, I really enjoyed it. It helped me, to spend 1 hour outside of shelter talking with an excellent speaker. And I am very grateful for you. I will just plug in one thing. It's that what we do in the end of all conversations, we also emphasize on behalf of Kyiv School of Economics, we ask our audience to donate, to keep donating, to support Ukraine with humanitarian aid. The thing is that, it's a humanitarian crisis. A lot of civilians are suffering, but also army is suffering. And we as Kyiv School of Economics, we created our own fundraising and to support life of people. Yeah, we purchase medicine, we purchase helmets, we purchase vests. And the thing is that we know how to do logistics here. So there are so many people around the world that try to help Ukraine, but sometimes logistically, it's very difficult to organize it very fast and efficiently. And people who are here on the ground, they know how to do it. And we are not the only organization. There are many organizations on the ground that work in it. We are just one of them. And we take this, advantage of talking to our academic community, to address our bubble. So please, if you want to donate, you can donate to us. I just put this link in the comment section. You can just type in Kyiv School of Economics to Google. You will find our page immediately. On the first webpage, there is a button to donate. And it's very easy to do. You can donate in euros, dollars, crypto. We are actually registered in Washington, D.C., so you can expect all the tax deductions. Everything is legal and transparent. So please support Ukraine with your donations. And Bruce, thank you very much again. I cannot find words, but I'm very grateful. And this was a pleasure to meet you online. And I hope to invite you to Peaceful Kyiv to give a lecture and to talk about your new books and fascinating ideas.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much for having me. Stay safe, and let's hope for a peaceful and good outcome for Ukraine.
Thank you very much.